All right, hello everybody. So last week we had to pick a topic to do a presentation on. Knowing nothing about it, I chose gamification, and so here we are. A lot of you, I don't think I've ever seen any of you. My name's Caleb Weens, and here's my presentation. So in this presentation, I'm going to be going over just what gamification is to start out with. You notice that there's the little numbers on the presentation itself. I will have those numbers right over here at the start of every new section, just as a way of saying, hey, we're transitioning from one thing to the next. So I'll start out with just a definition of gamification, what it is not. After that, I'll describe how it's been used in the classroom. And mostly that will be used through pictures. Some of those will be great examples, some of those will be horrible. And that's intentional. I'll describe the pros and cons of the technology. So that will be through two testimonials by teachers where I just bold certain sections of the testimonial that I think are really pertinent and really helpful to understanding gamification and what people think of it. And then finally, we'll talk about the research on the technology and what the literature says it should be able to do or it should not be able to do. So here we go. So what is gamification? According to Dieterding, without a date, gamification is the use of game design elements in non-game contexts. That in and of itself is incredibly broad. So once again, it's the use of game design elements in a non-game context. So that can look like the following. Some of you will have played video games. I don't know how old many of you are, but I imagine most of you have at least seen a video game. So one thing you see a lot, and I have these three bolded, because these I feel are the most common elements. So badges. There's a lot of examples of badges up here. Badges are things that people get when they accomplish something. It could actually be something they have to accomplish. It could be something that they're just simply given by being on for a certain amount of time. That comes down to the type of badge you use, and that is entirely up to the teachers, bosses, because most of gamification was actually used in business before education. But it's up to the teacher's discretion of how you use these badges. Both on the bottom left and over here, where I'm circling with my laser pointer, is two examples of leaderboards. Leaderboards are pretty self-explanatory. It's just like a scoreboard at a football game. It tells you who's winning. It's normally ordered. However, with these, the leaderboards, they typically have a lot of people on them. They can have everyone. They don't necessarily have to have everyone. Leaderboards almost always go hand in hand with points. You may not specifically say the points of the person, but they do have to be based on something. Below that are achievements and levels, which I don't have bolded because I couldn't find many examples of them being used. However, there was several pieces of literature that said those were very characteristic. One more thing that I didn't include here that I might have is another common design element that you'll see in games is a unifying story. So in a game you'll have, just sticking with the standard games, you'll have Link going around Hyrule trying to save Zelda. And there's that story of his progression through the whole thing that ties the whole game together. It's not just a random thing followed by a random thing followed by a random thing. A unifying story for your entire class is also an example of gamification. Any of these elements can contribute to gamification. So one thing you'll see really commonly that people tend to confuse is the idea of gamification and game-based learning. So gamification, just by strict definition, gamification is the use of game design elements in a non-game context. Hopefully that sounds familiar. So a good example of that we all use, well, I don't know, that is very commonly used in classrooms is Kahoot, which is it's normally a review game. You'll notice, okay, on this PowerPoint, you'll notice that this bullet point and this bullet point right here both have an asterisk next to them. That is because these are not high quality academic definitions, but these are good ways to separate the two. So gamification is the use of game design elements. In gamification, the game aspects form a structure in which learning occurs or engagement is increased. That's a good rule of thumb. Normally, in gamification, the game is secondary to the learning. Game-based learning, which is not what this presentation is about, but I want to be able to differentiate between those two because I feel like it's important for us to know specifically what we're talking about and what we're not talking about. Game-based learning is learning through playing games. In gamification, the game is secondary. In game-based learning, the game is primary. So you'll notice down here I have a picture of Sid Meier's Civilization. So I actually have not played this version of that game. However, in that game, one of the things you'll do a lot is you have to do diplomacy. And what people have done in the past affects how a country thinks of you. So an example of using game-based learning would be having students use that idea, play Civilization, and then use the game to help learn how diplomacy is affected by the history two countries have had towards each other. In game-based learning, the game itself is the focus and learning occurs because of the game. The cognitive residue, what's left over of the game, that is the learning that occurs. Gamification, the game is secondary. Game-based learning, the game. All right, section 2. Hopefully I'll speed up a bit because this is already at 7 minutes. So gamification in the classroom. Gamification is the use of game design elements in non-game contexts. Sounds familiar, I hope. That's incredibly broad. Following is an example of what gamification can look like in a classroom. This is not what it has to look like. A lot of these are really bad examples, and that's really intentional. The following could be anywhere from great ideas to absolutely unethical and potentially lose your job worthy. I did that intentionally. A question I have for you guys is, which of the following examples, out of the following examples, identify which one or ones you think would be the most effective. If you'd prefer to go, which one do you think would be most likely to make you lose your job? Have fun. All right, gamification via badges. Badges is something that shows up a lot in gamification. You'll notice that everything I have in this is in quotes. That's because I took it verbatim off a Edmodo blog. Edmodo is supposed to be something like Teacher Facebook where you include your students. I don't use it, so I don't know more than that. So with this, their shared badges idea. Last summer, we released student badges, a feature that allows you to incentivize your students and provide recognition for their achievements. Since the release, millions of badges have been awarded in Edmodo. With spring testing happening in many schools across the US, we've seen an increase in the number of badges being awarded. So we thought we'd provide you with some tips to help you use the badges. And then this was actually in the next paragraph, which is why I broke quotes. You can award a badge to multiple students from your group manage page. Simply visit the manage page, select all the students who you want to award the badge, and then select award badge. So that's an example where you basically go to a student's profile. I'm going to use Facebook language because most of you have one of those. You go to the student's profile, you click award badge, and then bam, they get an award badge. So if the student was on the ball and you're in elementary school, for example, you could give them the elephant on a ball, or if you have a hot topic that you're presenting, you could give your award the badge so people knew, or whatnot. That's what gamification via badges could potentially look like. Leaderboards via public data displays. Okay. I have no words here really. This is just some examples. So all of these three pictures were found from the same from the same source, which is right here, gettingsmart.com. To leaderboard or not to leaderboard. So here are some examples. Here we have a GPA wall. If you look right here, you can see the 4.0s, the 3.0s, the 2.0s, and the 1.0s and the belows. The 1.0 has a little encouraging "you can do it" sign. I'm sure the kids love that. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be sarcastic in this. Over here you have students' math scores displayed right above their backpacks, where the students themselves had to graph their supplies, and then they have the public data display. And with a lot of these students, fortunately, you can see their scores going up, and a lot of them start to plateau fairly higher. Over here you have what was referred to as a penguin chart in the source, where you have little penguins for how many standards the students had met. So every single one of those penguins was a student, and they were given little homework assignments, and if they had done 25% of the homework assignments, they'd have a dot right at 25 with their name on it. They're organized by teachers. A pertinent question to ask at this point is, how do you make a leaderboard that isn't public humiliation for low-performing students, or even encourage a race to the bottom? Here's another example of a leaderboard. This one is one that I won't spend much time on at all. You'll notice that if you're familiar with Khan Academy, you'll get points for accomplishing a video or for watching certain parts of the video. So in this, you'll notice that there's a lot of people with a name followed by an asterisk. There's one person right here at number 8, another person right here at 10, and then 12 and 13 who don't have asterisks next to their name. I would like you to know that the asterisk means the person cheated from the majority of their points. That's kind of the point here. And then finally at 15, I would like to apologize to those who felt their efforts were wasted or invalidated, is what it goes on to say, by the people hacking. So one thing to be careful with on leaderboards is making sure they're not easy to hack. So you should probably use someone else's software or not make them national. Anyways, these are some ideas from Teacher Thought. So these are some examples of ideas of gamification in the classroom. Some ideas can be a challenge or activity with more than one way to be solved. So you give them open-ended games, basically, open-ended questions. You give them grading by adding points. So that could include something like, I've had college classes where there were 100-point classes where it was known that there would be every single assignment had a given amount of points, and then you watched your percent add up to that 100%. Clearly, you wouldn't do a 100-point class with most high schoolers or junior hires because that's really high stress. But watching your points add up is a good way to is one way that can be gamification-like, because it simulates an XP bar, experience bar, on most games. A teacher giving badges instead of grades. I mentioned that earlier briefly. So this would be, you give badges for, say, kid being able to know their multiplication tables. My words aren't working too well right now. Up to 10, or what have you. When a student sets their own goals, then tracks their progress in a fun visual way. So that's similar to what was above. When students assume specific perspectives in learning, such as judge, designer, father, this element of fantasy roleplay is a big draw of video games. So you make kids take up roles and then act out what they would do through that role. Just some examples. And once again, the question I asked you earlier was, what of these do you think would be the most effective? So this is something that my school district is doing that I feel like is worth bringing up at this point. So USD 259, Wichita Public Schools, are changing from traditional grading to standards reference grading. So what that means is I'm a high school physics teacher. I feel like that background is pertinent here. So normally an A is 100 to 90, then so on and so forth. So this changes the idea from grades being that scale to grades being a 0 to 4 scale. And that 0 to 4 is strictly based on how well a student meets a standard. So that can be assessed through a test, that can be assessed through projects, through a lab, or whatnot, but it's how well they meet that standard. So my question for you guys is, if that 0 to 4 scale was changed to silver, gold, bronze, developing a novice for 43210, and we're given badges, would this technically be considered gamification? And follow up, would it have any effect, be it positive or negative? All right, so teacher testimonials on gamification. I do want to point out before I go too far into this that these are not necessarily academic testimonials. These are just teachers who've used them. One thing that you'll notice is some people love gamification and some people hate it with a burning, fiery passion. The first will be a positive one, the second will be much less so. Right here, we have we have where those two testimonials are from. There will be a giant wall of text. If you'd like to read the whole text, have a wonderful time pausing the video. I will read the bolded sections because it's not worth our time to read everything. That's just part of it. All right, so one of them's from Teach Thought, the other one's from NEA. All right, so this is a massive section. I'm going to abbreviate some of what is being said. So this is a teacher who moved around a lot. He taught English in a South Korean island, and I'm saying he, I'm not actually sure. I believe it was a he. I believe it was he. But I'm going to call them they from here forward. They taught English in a South Korean island. They taught they taught reading and science in Houston, Texas, that is. So what they noticed is, first you'll see up here, as an ancillary English teacher, gamification helped me increase student talk by 300%. My 250 students completed over 27,000 quests or additional homework assignments they chose to do. The top 10% spent more than an hour outside of class speaking, and often the teacher was beat there by his students. By their students who were eagerly excited to start working on their daily quests. And then there's the bolded section. On average, in my first year of instruction, my students have performed 1.39 times the district norm and 1.82 times the district norm in my second year of teaching the subject. Or another way, traditional methods would have taken 14 to 18 months to achieve what I can do with games in 10. Gamification can be very effective, but it has to be done right. And also, as indicated by that 1.39 times followed by the 1.82, like anything, you have to grow into it. It takes time to start. All right, so this next one is from a NEA blog. This one I've already mentioned is not going to be as positive. So these are two different teachers actually. The top is one teacher. This top half is one teacher. This second half is another teacher. If you would like to read the source, I have that mentioned earlier in the PowerPoint. But I'm going to read the bolded sections here. And I quote, "But to many educators, the practice, granted the level of sophistication, varies greatly. The amounts of little more than a crude method to elicit a Pavlovian response from students." End quote. So basically, this is a common criticism that you'll see a ton, that gamification can just be a carrot and stick method of motivating students. All right, so the next section, we'll go on. We'll say soon he, being the teacher, allowed the students to collect badges and then turn them in for prizes, so the badge wasn't enough. So in this case, the practice of giving students badges for accomplishing a goal provided an initial boost to student engagement, but then faded into nothing, and he had to start just saying, okay, give me your badges, I'll give you food. So in this case, badges did not work well at all. All right, and then this is from Kathy Sierra, who's a blogger. She says, "A well-designed game employs certain mechanics to support an intrinsically rewarding experience. When you remove that experience but keep the mechanics, you are now working from an entirely different psychology than actual games. And it is one that, in essence, uses mechanics to drive mechanical behaviors." Once again, some people love this, some people hate it. It can be viewed as total Pavlovian. You do this, you get a stick. You get a reward, you do something else, you get a whack. You get a punishment. These behaviors are not associated with, and this is reading from down here, these behaviors are not associated with the kind of robust, deep, and durable motivation we want from our students. All right, so I'm going to recap everything. So gamification is using game principles to assist in the classroom or elsewhere. As I said, this actually comes from the business world. These principles typically include badges, leaderboards, points, achievements, or levels. Storytelling is also a common one. Gamification can be done for an activity or for an entire class. You can play a Kahoot, and that's gamification of a review, or you can turn your whole class into some sort of adventure where you're trying to save Princess Peach from Bowser. And the students, anyways, it can be very broad. Gamification can have tremendous positive effects or be a disaster or anywhere in between. That's why this is so controversial. How it is implemented decides how effective it is, just like any other educational thing. All right, section 404, gamification in the research. I want to get a couple disclaimers out of the way. Most of the studies I found use college students as their subjects. I'm saying most, but I actually believe that's all. Nearly every study I used said that this is still an emerging field and significantly more research is needed. This following section is not a tutorial in how to do gamification. I don't have that here, but it's just what the research says about gamification or about aspects of gamification. Differentiating gamification and game-based learning is difficult, and sometimes research uses the two terms interchangeably. I believe I selected things which only were talking about gamification. I believe these are all about gamification, but if you want to check me, feel free. All right, so in this first section, there's some quotes here. I'm going to talk about the quotes. I'm not going to read the whole thing. But I do want to say straight off the bat, this is who it's from right here, and that I took out all of their citations, and because otherwise this would have been huge. In the first part, I am going to read this whole thing. The majority of papers report encouraging results from the experiments, including significantly higher engagement of students in forums, projects and other learning activities, increased attendance, participation, and material downloads, positive effect on the quantity of students' contributions, so the number without a corresponding reduction in their quality, increased percentage of passing students and participation in voluntary activities and challenging assignments, and minimizing the gap between the lowest and the top graders. That's about as glowing a review as you can possibly ever get. Gamification should be used, gamification elements should be used without naming them explicitly. The change from traditional style classroom to new learning environments should be introduced slowly. That's pretty straightforward. It's important that when you're using gamification, you don't just say, okay, now your quizzes are going to be called quests, and your tests are going to be called boss fights, and that's all the change. And then you just you bring it in like that. It's important to take your time in bringing it in. I feel like that's fairly understood. All right, gamification as a whole. Okay, so this is from a literature review. The study involved a Indiana University professor gamifying his class by renaming the tasks. Like I mentioned earlier, he changed the names from writing papers to crafting. That was a specific example. So in this, this is a quote out of a paper. Although this is possible, and this being the average grade in the class went up by a whole letter grade upon him starting to change the names of his things and introduce gamification concepts. So although this, once again, this being his grades rising a whole letter grade is possible, this example is included here first because it points out the common conception of what gamifying a classroom means. Implementing game components by simply trading out the parlance of pedagogy for that of gaming culture. So the paper then went on to say, Lawley, who is criticizing this, Lawley is not suggesting game elements should be avoided, but rather she is suggesting the importance of allowing them to surface as part of a deeper implementation. So in other words, part of gamification is changing things' names, but if you are only changing things' names in gamification, you're doing it wrong. All right, gamification is a whole 3. This is fairly boilerplate that you'll see in a lot of research, but I feel is especially true here. You might have noticed that all of the research I had was done, almost all of the research I've had here was done in the last 5 to 10 years. That's because this is a really new field. There's limited research upon which to draw conclusions about the impact of gamification on student academic success and performance. Increased class participation and class attendance was seen as a result of gamification and is positively correlated with improving student performance. In 2 studies, there was an increase in the number of students attaining high grades and a reduction in the gap between the lowest and highest student grades. In one study, by Charles and al., reported that there was a 12.9% reduction in the number of learners who failed a first-year computer course. This was once again about college students. But gamification as a whole, when done right, important caveat there, gamification when done right, sharply boosts a lot of things that we know are likely to increase student achievement. It can do that to the effect of, in one study, so this is not indicative of how it always behaves. In one study, it significantly reduced the number of students who fail the class. Gamification can be very powerful. Okay, the next part is badges. Badges are incredibly controversial. All right, I'm going to read the bold parts. If you'd like to read everything, feel free, pause the video. So skill badges. Skill badges are ones that you earn by attaining a skill. Skill badges earned by the low-performing students did not correlate with the change in performance avoidance goals. So earning skill badges did not result in low performers having less performance avoidance. We also conclude that different types of badges from this bold section, we also include that different types of badges will also affect learning performance, since motivation can predict future learning performance. So in this, the real thing I would put this section in here to emphasize was different type of badges affect different students differently. Badges affect high-performing and low-performing students differently. Participation badges versus skill badges also affect students differently. This next section I'm going to read the entirety of because I feel that it's really, really important. We believe that our findings are compatible with the research, finding that extrinsic motivators can have negative influence on learning. Participation badges earned eventually by all learners had meaningful explicit connection to individual measures of skill. Consequently, learners might not be able to make a connection between internal motivation and participatory badges, perceiving them as only external motivators. So participation were viewed as external motivators. Skill badges awarded based on direct student performance, perhaps, could be more easily connected to internal motivation, and thus considered by learners as an intrinsic motivator. These are both by the same study. Be careful with awarding badges. Badges are really controversial in the literature. Make sure you do them well. All right, Kahoot. Kahoot is one of the shining examples where a lot of teachers use gamification because it works really well. In short, I'm running late already. It can be concluded that Kahoot and Quiz, as gamification platforms, are able to enhance student engagement. So Kahoot is an example of gamification. It's really low effort for a teacher to use. And one of the things that's really important on anything like this is the ease of use for teachers and students. The gamification of learning environment must ensure that technology selected is easy to use and is able to attract the students to increase student engagement in the classroom. Just because you have a game doesn't mean it will increase student engagement. It has to be good and fairly easy to use. So summary, an educator interested in harnessing the dynamics that underlie games would be well served to focus on the game dynamics above. This was not from the original study. I included this. Freedom to fail, rapid feedback, progression, storytelling is there seen to prove successful to some degree throughout the literature. However, the choice of which to employ and which to eschew can only be made by those within this context. As was seen in the case studies, methods that may well work well in one context are not guaranteed to work well in another. This is by Stoughton Newstander. Gamification has to be done. It has to be done well, but it has to be done with your students in mind. You can't have a one-size-fits-all gamification to use with all students. It does not work. In this, there are 3 case studies of professors who tried very similar things in very different areas, and it didn't succeed. It did succeed some places. It didn't succeed ever. So this is my concluding thoughts. Gamification can be very effective, but not always. Make sure you do your homework and use your intuition about how your students will respond to gamification. When I say do your homework, I mean do some research on how to do gamification well. Because just including badges, for example, if you only throw badges in places, it's not effective. You have to do them right. If you're intending to use it in your classroom, start small and build up. And this is from one of the studies I mentioned earlier. The tricky part, and the part that is ultimately at the core of the experience being gamification, is identifying intrinsic rewards relative to the culture of the local community. That is, that one is seeking to engage, and building game-like interactions on top of this. What you do has to be something that people from the local culture, that your students can engage with. If you're able to meet that, your students are likely to engage well with gamification. If it's something foreign to your students, if it's something that they have no experience with, gamification will fall flat.